great to see you all again. The topic is communication and time, or how the notions we saw in the previous lecture can help us analyze and think about communication and time. So this was a picture I found that I like to relate communication and time. This is partly based on joint work with my former PhD student, Ido Ben Zvi. This is a slide we've already seen, so I'll skip it. There are lots of models of distributed computing, and I will just recall for at least one person here who wasn't in my previous talk. So I'm going to apply a basic connection between knowledge and action called the knowledge of preconditions principle, which says that if something is a necessary condition for performing some action A, then knowing it is a necessary condition for performing A. And again, for whoever was not here before, I know most of us, I was here last time, we're here. So the definition of knowledge is you know something if it's guaranteed given your local state. So we have a set of all possible scenarios, all possible histories, all possible runs, and at any given time in a run, each one of the agents has a well-defined local state, and I denote here the dashed line between 2 points. This is some time t in run r, and this is some time t prime in run r prime, and so on. So this dashed line means that I has the same local state at both points, in both global states. And the definition of knowledge is that if I'm at a point where all the points in which I have the same local state, phi is true, where phi is some condition, x equals 0, someone failed, 3 messages have already been delivered, or whatever I care to talk about. So if phi is true at all points at which I have the same information that I have now, then ki phi, which we read as agent I or process I knows phi, would be said to be true here. Okay? So I'm looking at you mainly because, makes sense? Okay. And essentially, if there is a possible scenario where I have my information as phi and phi is false, then I don't know phi. That's equivalent way of saying this. And again, well, this is the definition. At time t in a run r, with respect to a set of runs r, ki psi is true if psi is true at all other points at which I has the same local state. Again, this is purely information based in the sense that it's completely insensitive to computation. You know all theorems of mathematics, and so on and so forth. So if my local state and the set of runs guarantee it's true, then I know that it's true. Okay, so I'm going to start with 3 basic theorems. One you've already seen, and 2 which will be new and will relate knowledge and coordination, and then we'll use it to analyze how time affects coordination. So this was the theorem from the last slide. It basically said if psi is a necessary condition for I performing A in R, whenever does I A, which means whenever process I performs A is true, psi is true, then ki psi is also a necessary condition for does I A in R, and we spent 15 minutes before lunch discussing this. And now, we also saw how to apply this in the design of consensus. So now I want to apply this in the analysis of coordination more generally. And I want to consider a situation in which we have 2 actions, we have 2 agents, you and me, and two actions. A1 for you, you're 1 and I'm 2. And these actions are supposed to be performed simultaneously. So we say that two actions are simultaneous in a given set of runs. So if we have a protocol that guarantees that we only act simultaneously, then in all executions, whenever you perform A1, I perform A2, and vice versa. Okay? So we say that A1 and A2 are simultaneous in R with respect to a set of possible executions if the fact that I'm performing A2 must be true when you're performing A1, so it's a necessary condition for you performing A1, and vice versa. I mean, if they can only happen together, then mine cannot happen if yours is not happening, and vice versa. Okay, that's...
So the time doesn't enter into this?
There is a... I mean, we're talking about points during the execution, so it means now. Time is now.
So now it's really strictly not, because it's a different place.
No. So you think of, I mean, we're not at the workshop on relativity. Everything is at rest. There is a notion of global time. So from the outside, there is a notion of, I mean, at the global state, you are in some state, I'm in some state. You can be performing an action, I can be performing an action. And what this A1 and A2 are simultaneous if you perform A1, if and only if I perform A2. And these are instantaneous, not actions that take time, they're instantaneous. Performing it is a pointwise.
So does everything has a timestamp and these two timestamps are the same?
Well, I mean, they don't really have a timestamp because we say that there is, say, time 0 and the state at time 1 and state at time 2. So this is R, 2, and it could be that, you do B and I don't do anything, and then at time 3, we're both doing A1 and A2 or whatever. So it's well defined. You can say, now I send you a message, tomorrow I don't send you a message, and then I send you 3 messages. So we associate it, but the action is just an action, and when it happens, you read from the run. Okay? So now, if my performing the action is a necessary condition for yours, and your performing is a necessary condition for mine, then you have to know my action is a necessary condition for yours. We apply knowledge of preconditions. It means you have to know that I'm performing my action when you perform your action. Right? That's what knowledge of preconditions. If anything has to be true when you're performing an action, you have to know it. In particular, if my moving has to be true when you move, you have to know that this is true. If there are questions, we should discuss them. It's not proof by intimidation, so please feel free. But, okay? So now, your knowledge of my performing A2 is a necessary condition for you moving. And you performing A1 is a necessary condition for me performing A2. So we can combine these two and says that your knowing that I'm moving is a necessary condition for my moving. I can't perform an action unless you know I'm performing this action. Right? I mean, this has to be true whenever this is true. And this, in turn, has to be true whenever this is true. So, by transitivity, your knowing I'm moving is a necessary condition for my moving.
No, I understand it as a definition, but...
we had a theorem, we proved it.
I wonder whether you would have a practical example. I mean.
We have practical examples. Now we're going through the formalism, then we're going to have the practical examples, and we're going there. It's the beginning. So, because you're knowing that I'm moving is a necessary condition to my moving, and anything that's a necessary condition to my moving, I have to know. I mean, my knowing it is a necessary condition. K2, K1, 2 is moving, is a necessary condition for 2 moving. And so it's also a necessary condition to 1 moving by transitivity. So you, my knowing that you know that I'm moving is a necessary condition for you moving. So you have to know it by knowledge of preconditions, right? And we can go on. The slide is short, and the story goes on indefinitely. And what this really says is that if A1 and A2 are simultaneous actions, then when we perform these actions, I need to know that you know that I know that I'm for any finite depth.
You say necessary condition, but it's also by definition sufficient.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, the fact that it's sufficient doesn't help me do the induction, because my theorem, my knowledge of precondition theorem, uses necessary conditions to generate new necessary conditions. But it's also sufficient, of course. Whatever I know, so the definition of knowledge has the property that ki phi implies phi. This is valid. Whenever I know something, it has to be true, because it's in particular needs to be, I mean, the current point is one in which I have the same local state as I have in the current point. So, yeah. Okay? So, there's a notion called common knowledge, defined by the name was termed by David Lewis in the late 60s and was defined just before that. And basically, if you have some set of processes, set of names, G, then we say that G have common knowledge of phi, of psi, if for any string of names with repetitions from G, so I1, I2 up to IM for any M, KI1, KI2, and so on, KIM psi holds. So you know that I know that she knows that you know that she knows that you know that he knows that she knows. For all possible strings is true, then we say that this fact is common knowledge, which seems like a very far-fetched thing, right? You have to have all these states of knowledge. But in fact, the reasoning I gave on the previous slide was the template for the inductive argument that says that if we have a set of actions that are simultaneous actions, I mean, they could be A1, A2, or they could be a larger set for a larger set of agents. So if you have a set, A, capital A, of necessarily simultaneous actions in our system, then any necessary condition for one of these actions has to be common knowledge when they're performed. Okay, so I'll give you now I'll give 2 practical, but okay, this is now the argument I gave before is essentially the inductive step for this result. It's a connection between simultaneous actions and common knowledge, and that these two were related is well known from, I guess, from my thesis, but from early work with Joe Halpern in the late 80s. So here's a practical example. So there's a problem called the firing squad. Essentially, it's a problem of coordinating some simultaneous action in response to some external signal. So there's an external input to the system, some alarm message comes, someone announces something, and the requirement is that if anyone receives an alarm message, then later on everyone should perform, say, raise a flag, or we call it fire, perform a particular action at the same time. Okay, these things, I mean, simultaneous actions are actually relevant. Some announcements should only be done, I don't know, simultaneously in London Stock Exchange, in New York, in order not to cause arbitrage or whatever. We have, or you want simultaneous actions if you're applying lasers in surgery, and you want the lasers to reach the same point at the same time. And so, I mean, a corollary. So this is the firing squad problem. And the corollary of the connection between common knowledge and simultaneous actions is that, in fact, the fact that an alarm message has been received is a necessary, it has to be common knowledge. I mean, common knowledge of the fact that an alarm message has arrived is a necessary condition for performing a firing action. Okay, so if you have actions that are required to happen simultaneously, then the type of information you have to obtain about them is common knowledge, not just knowing that we need to do it, but I need to know it, I need to know that you know it, and that you know that I know it, and all levels. So since we do need sometimes in a problem like this to coordinate simultaneous actions, we do need to attain common knowledge. And of course, common knowledge of an alarm is, well, I don't know, of course, but it's a necessary and sufficient condition, because common knowledge, when it happens, everybody knows that it's common knowledge. And that's a property of common knowledge that I show here. But if something is, if C is common knowledge, then everybody knows it's common knowledge. So when it becomes common knowledge, everyone knows it's common knowledge, and so they can act at the instant at which the fact becomes common knowledge. One. Good. Clear.
Wait, but it may be common knowledge, but not everybody knows that it's common knowledge, because like the fact that it's common knowledge is not may not be common knowledge.
No, it is. I mean, at least we have a definition of knowledge. So the definition of knowledge you can take as a property on graphs, right? You take a graph with all the similarity edges between two nodes and whatever. So something is common knowledge. Now you look at this graph. We have a set of agents, maybe say common knowledge to everyone. Okay, so a fact is common knowledge to you know a fact if it's true at all the Klim neighbors of the current point. You know that Omri knows if at all Klim neighbors, all Omri neighbors, this fact is true. It's common knowledge if at all reachable points, that is in the whole connected component in this graph, phi is true. And if phi, I mean that you have to believe me, but
maybe phi is true, like everybody knows that phi is true, but not everybody knows that everybody.
Then it's not common knowledge.
Okay.
So there is a difference, an essential difference between everybody knows to, or everybody knows that everybody knows, and 20 levels and 1,000 levels, and common knowledge. Common knowledge, phi is common knowledge if phi is true in the whole connected component in this graph. So now if you go to all the Klim neighbors, they're in the same connected component as the current point. So for them also, it's true in the whole connected component. So if it's common knowledge, then Klim knows it's common knowledge, and likewise for everyone else.
It just, to me, it looks as if this issue, the sufficient thing is bothering me, because it ties the timing unnecessarily just to the spreading of the knowledge. Because it could be, for example, that we know the necessary condition for the lecture to begin here is that everybody knows that it begins at 2:30, but they may learn about it at 2:10, but it will still begin only at 2:30.
That's right.
So the common knowledge already happened at 2:10. Nevertheless, it will begin.
No, but the common knowledge is common knowledge that the fact is true now. So it was true at 2:10 that the lecture is in 2:30, and that's fine.
No, but what I'm saying, that common knowledge occurred already at 2:10.
So why if we change the algorithm?
No, but okay, if the action is I'm going to go somewhere tomorrow, then having common knowledge of it, I can't allow, it will have to be true. So there's another, okay, it's necessary and condition for firing squad.
Yeah.
Firing squad says, if I have a protocol in which when it's common knowledge an alarm message arrived, I fire. Then what I argued before was the common knowledge is going to happen at once for everyone. So everyone, if everyone follows this, then they all fire at once. If it's about something happening tomorrow, then we have common knowledge, but that we're not acting on it because we're going to act tomorrow. Here, if we do it, if we fire, so here's this particular problem. If an alarm message arrives, then sometime later we have to fire. And a solution, which is in a sense an optimal solution, says, I don't know, send pass information, I don't know, full information or whatever. When you have common knowledge, an alarm message arrived, fire. Of course, you cannot fire before that because we have a theorem in the Theorem 2. So we can't fire before it's common knowledge. And the common knowledge arises simultaneously, so if we do just at that time, we are satisfying the specification. So this is actually a basis for various old optimality results related to consensus and firing squad and things like that. Simultaneous consensus, I'm not going to talk about that more. Yes?
When you say optimality requires this, isn't it that solvability would already require it? I mean, any solution...
No, of course. It's... Okay, no, not every solution requires... So it doesn't have to require the ability to compute common knowledge in general. This requires sort of in general. So, for example, one application in the 90s that I promised I won't talk about was the consensus problem we discussed before. Suppose you were required to agree at the same time. We all have to do it exactly in the same round. Okay? Then the first algorithm, the first protocol I gave, does that. I mean, then it has to be common knowledge we're deciding there. And the first algorithm which said, go until round t plus 1, until time t plus 1, and then if you know 0, decide 0, otherwise decide 1. It was a correct protocol, and by definition it decides simultaneously, because we all decide at time t plus 1. We didn't do anything very interesting. The optimal, if you want to do it faster, and you can do it faster, then you have to figure out that it's common knowledge earlier, and that can be quite a bit harder. So sometimes, if you wait long enough, you're guaranteed of things without having to solve the general problem of given a formula and some model, is that formula common knowledge? This is required for, if you want to say, well, at the first time at which this is common knowledge, do it, you will need to find a way of computing it, and there's some technical... Okay, so one interesting observation that this leads to is there are lots of models in interactive communication, distributed computing, in which the protocol, the algorithms are assumed to start at a given time and maybe go in rounds. This is true in the congest model, in the local model, in the model of consensus that I discussed in the last hour. And in fact, if you assume that a protocol will start, everyone starts simultaneously, well, the start is a simultaneous action. So, in fact, the participants have to have common knowledge that this is a starting time. Because, I mean, it's not really when the world, Big Bang happens. We start protocol that, if the protocol assumes that we all start at the same time, then this has to be orchestrated in some way. And that means we have to attain common knowledge that we're going to start this protocol. Now, this can be quite reasonable if we're running some protocol, we have a global clock, and we're running this periodically. Every midnight, every million clock cycles or whatever, we run consensus or whatever. So if we once synchronize it, then yeah, we can do it simultaneously, no problem. But if we're going to run a consensus algorithm in response to some event happening, some external input, then assuming that it starts at the same time is non-trivial, because it requires common knowledge. Now there some algorithms, say maximum independent set, very quick local algorithms. Go for in log n steps, they compute a maximum independent set, assuming we all start at the same time. But coordinating us to start at the same time may require order n steps or whatever, depends on the model. So what this slide is suggesting is that the assumption that we start simultaneously is a non-trivial assumption. Sometimes it may be very reasonable, and other times it's hiding quite a bit of coordination of pre-processing that we're not always required to pay for or to account. And that's something to consider. Okay, so simultaneity is related to common knowledge, and now we're going to go and talk about knowledge and time. So I want to talk about temporal coordination. I'm going to look at a puzzle which I call the frozen account puzzle. And here we have three main players, Alice, Bob, and Charlie. There's a side show by Susan. And the story is that Charlie gave Alice a check, which she would like to cash. But his account is frozen because of credit problems. And Bob is the banker who can unfreeze the account. So in fact, what they need to do is to coordinate three events in a particular order. So they need to have Charlie deposit a sufficient amount of money to convince the bank to reactivate the account. Then Bob should reactivate the account. And after that, Alice can cash the check. If Alice goes and tries to cash the check before Bob acted, then she gets a fine. She doesn't get $1,000, she has to pay $80. If Bob reactivates before Charlie deposits the sum, then he can get fired because he gets paid for managing accounts correctly. So in fact, these things need to happen in this order. And now, so this is an instance of ordering, and we say that some k actions, A1 to AK for agents 1 to k, are temporally ordered in a set of runs if AJ is never performed before AJ minus 1 has been performed. Okay, if the times at which they're performed are TJ for AJ and TJ minus 1 for AJ minus 1, then TJ is greater or equal to TJ minus 1. Okay? Now, the third connection, so now, what happens? Well, you see, if you should move first and I should move second, then your moving is a precondition for my moving. So I have to know that you moved, right? So we can use the knowledge of preconditions principle to prove by induction that if we have k actions that need to be ordered in the system, and some occurrence E, some event E, is a necessary condition for the first action, then for the seventh action, 7 needs to know that 6 knows, that 5 knows, and so on, that 1 knows that the event happened. Of course, when the first moves, he has to know that the event happened. When the second moves, then he needs to know that the first moves. If I assume that if you moved, you remember whether you remember this fact, so I add a bit of memory, I assume you remember at least whether or not you moved, then I can prove that, in fact, for the jth agent to perform the action, we need nested knowledge. J knows that J minus 1 knows, and so on, that 1 knows that the triggering event happened. Okay? So nested knowledge is related to ordered action. We have to have this, and under some conditions, this can also be sufficient. But the necessary condition for ordering relates to nested knowledge. We had action is related to knowledge, simultaneous action to common knowledge, and ordered action to nested knowledge. Okay, these are the three theorems. And now we're going to focus mainly on nested knowledge. And there's a famous result by Chandy and Misra very early in the game that showed that in an asynchronous system is a system in which there's no bound on how long messages take. So there, if an event occurs at time t at some site I0, and at a later time t prime, we have that m knows, that m minus 1 knows, so we have nested knowledge that this event occurred, then there has to be a message chain from I0, which is where E happened, to 1, and from 1 to 2, and from 2 to 3, and so on. So there has to be, in order for me to know that you know, that she knows, that he knows, that she knows that it happened, there has to be a message chain from the occurrence of the event to her, to him, to you, to her, to him, and to me in the other direction. Okay, the only way I can know that something happened somewhere is if there's a message chain from there to me. It doesn't have to be a direct message. It could be a message chain, but okay. So the only way, what this means, together with the previous theorem that says that we have to ensure nested knowledge in order to perform actions in order, if we want to order actions, we have to create message chains that correspond to it. Okay? Good. So now let's go back to the frozen account. And Bob knowing that Charlie deposited is a precondition, is a necessary condition for him to move. Alice knowing that Bob knows that the money was deposited is a necessary condition for her moving. And we need a message chain from Charlie through Bob to Alice in order to solve our problem. That's in the asynchronous world. Chandy and Misra say, well, this is all good and true in the asynchronous world, but we have no notion of time. If there is a notion of global clock, then processes can learn or forget just because time has passed, and our theories do not apply. So we want to talk about what happens in that case. Essentially, if we have a global clock, then lots of facts can be known without communication. I mean, the time can be is common knowledge. A protocol could guarantee, I could know that it's now 3 o'clock, so someone is asleep, or someone is out to coffee, even without hearing from them, just because every day at 3 o'clock they go to this coffee place, and so on. So I'm going to consider a model in which there are bounds on how long messages take, mainly upper bounds. And so assume that for every, the global clock should have been outside of the item. So we assume that we have a global clock, and the network, the model is just a graph, a directed graph, where for every edge there's an upper bound for how long messages take, and delivery is within this guaranteed bound. Okay? Now, we also assume that messages take at least one step to be delivered. So what we have is a labeled graph with mainly with the upper bounds. The upper bound on the message from Alice to Charlie is 11, from Charlie to Alice is 12, and for every other edge we could have bounds. Now, well, first of all, whenever we have, in this setting, we can actually have a nice analogy with space-time diagrams. So consider here each one of these nodes is going to be a pair I and T, so an agent at a particular time. And if there's an upper bound on how long messages take, then we can have a set of nodes in the future that are guaranteed, so time goes from left to right. So we have a set of nodes that are guaranteed to be affected or be informed of an event that happens at theta, because if you always you do full information, you send information about what happened at theta, then at the upper bound you're guaranteed to get to a certain set of nodes. Okay? Now a lower bound tells you, well, this is the fastest I can get to this node, so anything that is earlier than the lower bound is not going to hear about an event that happened at theta. And in the case of speed of light, then we have these two cones are the same, because the upper bound and lower bound are speed of light. But here we have an upper bound on how long it will take, and a lower bound, and they're different. So in fact, what happens is we have a set of nodes that are guaranteed to hear about what happens to me at time t, and ones that are definitely not going to, the information not going to reach them fast enough. And everything in the middle is undecided undetermined when an event happens. Now suppose a message is sent from me to a neighbor. It's going to arrive somewhere along this axis. I mean, this is the slowest and this is the fastest. In practice, it reaches you sometime in the middle. And then what happens to these is that the cone of affected nodes grows, because if it came faster than the slowest possible, and the cone of the darkness also grows if it didn't go as fast as possible. And so at any given time, the realized messages give you completely determined what's affected up to now, and as far as the future, there's the ones in the light, the ones in the darkness, and the ones that depend on the grace of fate. And at the end of time, we get this kind of picture. Okay, so fine. Now assume we have global clocks and we have these bounds. How does time come into play? So, of course, we could just hardwire the time at which these events happen, and that would be a solution. But this is actually not consistent with the story, because Charlie is not someone for whom we can give a protocol and expect him to follow it. We should consider the fact that Charlie finally deposited money to be, an act of God. It's an external input. This is a spontaneous event. If it happens, then we should have Bob respond to it. So if it becomes spontaneous, then we actually need information flow, both to allow Alice and Bob to know that finally the money came in, and also to allow them to coordinate their actions. So, of course, we can solve the problem by creating message chains as before. Okay, even though we have bounds, we can ignore them and give the asynchronous solution, and it will work. Okay? But the question is, will clocks help? So here we're going to look at, let's look at the scenario. Suppose that Charlie finally deposits at time t. And the message, signed message saying a deposit arrived, is broadcast to Alice and to Bob, and it has a name. This message is being sent to Alice and to Bob, sent at time t. Suppose that it reaches Bob at time t plus 2, and Bob immediately reactivates the account. It reaches Alice at t plus 4. And suppose that the bound on the channel between Charlie and Bob is 10. Okay? Then if Alice now goes to deposit the check, she gets the money, right? But she doesn't know that this is going to be the case, because as far as she is concerned, it could arrive anywhere between time t plus 1 and t plus 10. So she shouldn't, if she's prudent, she won't go to cash the check. However, at time t plus 10, she can go and cash the check. So, again, in this case, at time t plus 10, Alice will go to the bank, she'll cash the check, and this will be fine. Bob reactivated no later than the time she cashes the check, she gets her money. We actually managed to coordinate these events in this order without having any communication from Bob to Alice. Okay? So we don't have a message chain, and the reason we can do it is because they can coordinate based on the original message that came out at time t, and Alice guarantee that Bob will reactivate by t plus 10. Okay? Let's look at a second scenario, which is very similar, except Susan is also in the picture. Susan is Bob's boss at the bank, and Alice's friend. And the announcement goes to Bob and to Alice and reaches them at the same time, t plus 2 and t plus 4, but it reaches Susan at t plus 3, and she would like to help. So, of course, at this point, first of all, Alice knows that at t plus 10, she can go. Once she gets the message, t plus 4, t plus 10, I'll have my money. But now Susan goes and she rebroadcasts to Alice and to Bob, and suppose it reaches Bob at, her message reaches him at t plus 5, it doesn't really matter, and Alice at t plus 8. And I'm assuming that the bound from Susan to Bob is 4. So if she sends it at t plus 3, he's going to get it by t plus 7 at the latest and reactivate immediately. Okay, so now if Alice receives her message at t plus 8, she can cash the check. Right? Good. Fine. So now, I guess I have 5 minutes, but if I take a little more, I'll get a little farther. Okay, so now let's formalize this a little. So we had our network, our labeled graph, and I'm going to just define dij for 2 nodes to be the shortest distance on this graph between the nodes. Shortest distance in the classical graph theoretic sense. Okay? And so instead of 10 between x and u, it's 9 because we can go 6 and 3 instead of going directly. Okay? Now I'm going to say that there's the node j. So time t prime for process j stands in the bound guarantee to I at time t if t prime is greater than t plus dij. What does that mean? T prime is late enough so that a message sent at time t is guaranteed by I, is guaranteed to reach j by t prime. Okay, enough time has passed. This means at t prime, I can be guaranteed that its message arrived and doesn't need an acknowledgement. But not only I, anyone who knows that I sent this message will know that j received and it doesn't need an acknowledgement. So let's look at the scenarios we had before in terms of 2 notions. One is a message chain, completing a message chain. I'm not going to define that formally here, but and the other is a bound guarantee. On day 1, we had this picture. Between Charlie at time t and Alice at t plus 10, there was a message chain that completed. In fact, it went to time t plus 4. I mean, completed already at time t plus 4. And at time t plus 10, a bound guarantee between Charlie at t and Bob at t plus 10 exists. At t plus 9, we have the message chain, but we don't have the bound guarantee. Okay? That's day 1. Day 2, the picture looks like this. We have a message chain from Charlie through Susan that reaches Alice at t plus 8, and the bound guarantee between Susan at t plus 3 and Bob at t plus 8. Okay, at t plus 7, we had the bound guarantee, but we didn't have the message chain. So this is the first time at which we have both of these in this case. And again, here at t+8, Alice knew that Bob knows that Charlie deposited the money. Okay, we could also consider a solution to the problem, which we hadn't considered before, in which Alice will get the notification. She sends it to Bob, waits for the bound between her and Bob, and then she cashes the check. Then the picture would look like this. And if we just do the asynchronous solution, then we get a message chain from Charlie to Bob to Alice. And formally, there's a bound guarantee between Bob at the time whatever, t+4, and Bob at whenever Alice receives it. So in this scenario, the bound guarantee doesn't play a role, but the picture is still well defined. So all of these are actually instances of this picture, where there's a message chain from Charlie at time t to Alice at the time at which she acts. There's some node along this message chain, which could be the original one or could be somewhere along the line, from which there's a bound guarantee to Bob at this time. And intuitively, this allows Alice to know here that Bob now knows about this. Okay? So this intuition is actually captured by a theorem. It says, suppose that there's some spontaneous event happening here, and at time t prime, Alice knows that Bob knows that the event happened. Then this picture must exist. The connection between communication, this communication must have been realized. Okay? It also says that if we have to guarantee two events, Bob moving and then Alice moving, in that order, we have to create this, whether or not we believe in knowledge or not, whether we came to IHP or not, we have to have this. Okay? So this is a connection. This is the direct information, and it guarantees indirectly that certain things have happened, because here we look at the upper bound on how long this takes. This actually can be generalized to nested knowledge, which basically says that if an event happens here and at time t, and at time t prime, we have nested knowledge that it happened, then we have to have a message chain through a sequence of nodes from which where theta 1 has the bound guarantee to agent 1 at the current time, theta 2 to agent 2, and so on. This will guarantee to everyone that 1 now knows it. Theta 2 will guarantee to everyone that 2 knows that 1 now knows it, and so on. So a corollary of this theorem is, we don't get corollary? A corollary is that if we want to coordinate ordered actions in response to some trigger, then we have to create this structure which we call a centipede. And the centipede essentially captures the distinction between explicit information and what indirect information we can conclude about what happened in the world because time has passed. The bound guarantees guarantee that things happened without getting explicit indications, just because time has passed. And essentially, the structure of a centipede is the analog in the world with clocks and time of what message chains are in the asynchronous world. In the asynchronous world, you really need message chains. Here, you have a chain through witnesses, which don't have to be distinct. And essentially, the only way to coordinate ordered actions is by creating centipedes. From the centipede theorem, we can characterize when common knowledge can be captured. And common knowledge can be captured essentially if a broom is constructed. That is, there needs to be a message chain from the event to some node from which there's a bound guarantee to all nodes at the current time. So the only way to coordinate simultaneous actions is by creating this communication structure, which is called the Broom. And the only way to coordinate simultaneous actions in this world is actually by creating a Broom. So suppose I send you a message, my distance from the furthest guy or gal here is 100, and I say, this is time t, raise your hands at t plus 100. Now, Karen receives it at t plus 30, and she is 30 away from everyone. She can say, hey, Yoram said t plus 100, but no, do it at t plus 30. My bound is 30, so we can do it at t plus 60. So that's a natural way of coordinating simultaneous actions. The theorem says that this is a necessary structure, not only a good way to get an upper bound, to get a solution. This is the only way to get a solution.
But here you mean that it's the shortest path, like it's not necessary, but this path has a connection to everybody, but it has some path.
Paths, of course, yeah. I mean, it's all directed graph and whatever. So, taking a little extra time, but what I wanted to suggest here is that using this notion of knowledge, we can actually relate information and coordination in a very tight manner based on the knowledge of preconditions principle, which sort of applies and is a clean way of looking at things. It's broadly applicable both to design of protocols, to analysis of what's necessary, but also to analysis of any system, multi-agent system that has guarantees. So if an embryo develops in a certain way and some events have to happen before others can, then, well, whatever governs when things start has to satisfy this. So this could also be used by biologists. I've been using this to analyze asynchronous VLSI circuits and other things. So there are various extensions, and there's much room for further work. There's definitely questions of how to take variations to probabilistic settings, and there's lots more to look at here, but I think this, for me, these are fundamental properties that applies in all distributed systems. So these are universal theorems, which, as I said, we don't have any otherwise. And it would be very interesting for me to hear any ideas that people doing Kolmogorov complexity, information theory, or anything related have any questions, any ideas later as well. Because I think this is very closely related to information. This is how information and coordination are related, but the terminology and the whole game here is quite different. So I think there's lots of potential which still needs to materialize. So thank you. Questions? Well, you can you use the, so for example, one model for distributed computing and fault tolerance allows for lies. Then what you have there, what?
In your setting, there is no notion of lie, just family, they don't have sense, they are just symbols.
That's right.
They are allowed by art.
That's right. So what happens in these settings is that if I hear, if there's a bound on the number of liars, and I heard for more than the bound copies saying Klim said 0, then I know Klim said 0. But if I only hear from 3 people, maybe they're all liars. So you
And what if there is like just a bound of number of wrong messages out of all communication?
That's another assumption. It's another model. It gives you, whenever you have a protocol, then you're going to have a different set of executions. And that will imply different knowledge. When in the same execution, you have different knowledge if the set of possible executions is different. So it just modifies the model about which you're reasoning, but nothing in the basic notions. But then you might get different needs for communication, not having one centipede, but many copies, or I don't know, things like that. So there's many questions that are natural to consider in this setting. Yes, Karen?
So suppose whatever action you need to take depends on one of 2 things happening.
So you have to know that one of two. So there would have to be actually a message chain from one of them to you.
But how does this work with the common, with everyone knows the common knowledge about, because you don't know which one? So, I mean, you know that
There would have to be a pivot. I call this guy a pivot, the one that's, that pivot would have information that one of two things happened. It doesn't need to know which, because maybe it only got a signal that is true if one of these happened without knowing which one, right? There could be OR gates on the way or whatever. But you would have to have a single pivot there. The coordination requires a single pivot. It would imply the information, and here you allow weaker information, that's fine, but you would still need the same structure. Okay, so I'm here all of today and tomorrow, and I'll be happy to